Eos Island, The Rebirth, by Mr. Vogue, dedicated to Dawn Marie Parquet Squire, 1971 to 2021. The story Eos Island, The Rebirth, revolves around the mysteries of Eos Island, where a once thriving society met a cataclysmic end, leading to strange mutations and hidden experiments. A diverse group of individuals, drawn by curiosity, adventure, or hidden agendas, converge on the island, ultimately uncovering a conspiracy involving a powerful organization known as Final Day and the island's buried secrets related to the philosopher's stone, an element with extraordinary properties. Who or what else lurks in the frozen wasteland that is Eos Island, and who will survive to tell the story? Prologue. Inside an underground facility, somewhere on Eos Island. As the rusted metal door with the word Ares labeling it swings open, my soldiers and myself are met with three figures shrouded in shadow. Before I can make out anything aside from their gas-masked bullets start to whiz past my head, I dash for any cover I can find, ordering my squad to do the same. As I hit the ground behind a small stack of boxes, I realize more than half of my soldiers lay dead behind me. I cannot think, I do not have time. I quickly point my kalash toward the figures, unloading the magazine. As the last bullet is unloaded from my rifle, all is quiet. The smoke clears from in front of the barrel to reveal the shadows are no longer there. I quickly stand back up and regain my composure while never taking my eyes off of the doorway. Now my unit consisted of barely 5 able-bodied soldiers, not counting myself. But with no other choice, we pushed forward to try to find an exit to this facility. The hallways were pitch black, as if the place was abandoned, but it was clearly heated, and machinery could be heard echoing through the long corridors as we made our way down them. Every corner was met with more than the appropriate amount of caution, as it could be the end of our lives. As I approached what appeared to be the entrance into a very large open room, I could feel my heart inside my chest pounding, as if it wanted out as badly as I did at that moment. To my relief, in the dark open room, I could see another illusion, like the one that transported us here, slightly glowing in the back corner of the room barely 30 meters away. I let out a sigh of relief and ordered my soldiers to move as fast as they could, as it was our best chance at escaping. The instant I made it through the doorway again, bullets started to fly through the air. I felt a sharp pain in my shoulder as I pushed myself to keep running. The portal was right there. I could feel my feet taking me the rest of the way home, but it was short-lived as my body hit the ground. Suddenly, the pain in my legs became apparent. I had been hit by far too many rounds, and it had only been adrenaline pushing me this far. As everything began to be swallowed by a deep black darkness, I can see 2 of my squad disappearing into the portal. At least it wasn't all for nothing. Mission complete. Chapter 1. Alexei Kowalski. Curiosity kills. As the frosty wind bit Alexei's face, he stared off into the sea, thinking about his father Vashev Kowalski. He thought of how he was about to disappoint him deeply by disobeying his final wishes not to go back to the island. But Alexei could not hold back his curiosity any longer. He remembered all the times he would ask his father for information about his home on Eos Island, how his father would change the subject immediately and always stray from telling him much. The only information Vashev would ever tell Alexei was about his mother who had died on the island. He would tell Alexei all about how she was a brilliant scientist who could have changed the world for the better. However, most of the stories would turn to angered slurs about Eos and how it took her from them. All that Alexei could remember was playing in a big room with several other children while his parents worked, as well as the day his father carried him onto a small boat in the freezing cold and left the island. The ice grew thicker as Alexei maneuvered his fishing vessel around the ice drifts. The island's southern portion was completely covered in ice for what looked like miles. Alexei found a small passage between the ice along the side of the island, leading up towards the northern portion of Eos. He tried to focus on the dangerous route, but could not help thinking about how he had gotten here. After taking over the fishing business from his father, his curiosity grew day by day. Alexei researched what he could, but little turned up. All he could find was that the island was now military-owned. This only made his curiosity grow. Alexei couldn't bear it anymore. He had to figure out what had happened, why he had to leave his hometown, and what had happened to everyone he knew there. After weeks of research and reaching out to friends about the subject, he came to the conclusion that he would have to use one of his fishing vessels to make the journey. After all, Eos wasn't all that far off the northeastern coast of Russia, where Restic was located. Alexei prepared thoroughly for his trip, not knowing what to expect. He even managed to bring a couple firearms, God forbid. On the 5th of March, 2022, Alexei took to the open waters, leaving his lead captain in charge of the business until his return. As he made his way through the narrow passage between the ice, Alexei kept his binoculars in hand, searching for military vessels every chance he got. If any should capture him, he had decided to go under the guise of being a cargo ship who got lost during transport due to broken equipment. Alexei's excitement grew as he approached the northern end of the island, but it was short-lived when suddenly a loud crash was heard from beneath his feet. He raised his binoculars, but before they reached his face, everything went black. Arrival to hell. Waking up on a beach atop of a large piece of rubble from the ship, Alexei realized he'd been shot at by someone most likely the military. Without taking time to think or search the wreckage, he quickly made his way for the closest cover he saw. A great forest lush with pine trees. So dense it was as if the sun was drowned out. The only visible light was some bright blue electric bolts in the distance. They seemed to spread across the entire forest. Alexei figured there were some sort of electric wires running to the forest ahead, and that this was the cause of the arcing electricity. However, as he grew closer, he became even more curious. The electricity seemed to be coming from nothing, existing alone as a separate entity. Alexei's father was a very knowledgeable man, and taught Alexei much, but by no means was Alexei a man of science. While completely amazed by this discovery, it wasn't long before his feet began to wander as he heard a bubbling noise coming from behind where he'd just come from. Alexei then saw what looked to him like a puddle of toxic substance, still bubbling and releasing gases into the air. He retreated out of these anomalous woods, finding a small group of buildings which he soon realized were completely abandoned for at least a year or more. Realizing he was in serious trouble, if he couldn't find some supplies, Alexei started to scour the houses of the small village he soon came upon. He found some canned goods, but that was mostly all that was left behind. While searching, Alexei heard some footsteps from the house next door. He quietly moved around the corner to see who it was. He hoped it might be some local that could help, but after hearing a weak "help me" in a female voice coming from the steps, he began to move quicker. To Alexei's surprise, the footsteps he heard were not from a person at all, but from some grotesque creature, standing on 2 feet, taller than any man. The creature turned around to face Alexei quicker than he could hide. As the creature began to rush towards him, Alexei retreated into one of the houses, barricading himself inside. The creature thrashed the door, tearing chunks of wood away as it now screamed, "Help Emmy!" Alexei grabbed his holstered sidearm, only to hear a low and dreadful click. The weapon was still soaked from the wreck. Alexei quickly moved to an attic he had found the ladder, to just as the creature came bursting through the door. The door and cabinet blocking the doorway came crashing into the house, as did the creature behind it. Alexei couldn't hold in his fear. He wished he had listened to his father, not knowing what he had even gotten himself into. As the creature grew closer to Alexei, he could see its lower jaw was split apart at the center with rows of razor-sharp teeth and long spines stuck out its back that moved like the legs of a spider ripping at the wood in front of it. Alexei slammed the attic hatch door shut and placed everything he could find on top of it. As the creature tore at the wood, 5 gunshots were heard, followed by a loud thump. Not knowing what or who he would find down there, Alexei decided it was for his best interest to stay put until he knew more. He heard a low, saddened tone saying, "Rest in peace now, brother." Then no more than a minute later, a loud voice called out, asking if everyone was okay. Hearing the kindness in his voice, Alexei replied, telling the unknown man that he was all right, and removing the remaining furniture from atop the hatch. Comrades. Opening what little was left of the attic hatch, Alexei saw a fully geared military soldier. Knowing the soldier would most likely be taking him away for the rest of his life, Alexei immediately began pleading to the soldier. Before Alexei could get out half of his story, the soldier interrupted him, telling Alexei to be quiet before more gorgers heard him. The soldier told Alexei he didn't give a rat's ass why he was here, nor did it matter, because they were both in the same boat now. The soldier introduced himself as Private Dima Onoprienko and explained that he and his whole platoon were all abandoned on the island when a mission went very bad, and that the two of them were stuck on the island and there was no help. Alexei, having returned immediately to letting his curiosity get the better of him, inquired about the island and what was going on in Eos. Dima told Alexei his guess was as good as his. All that Dima knew was there were some kind of government facilities on the island, and he was sent there to make an outpost and discover what had happened. He explained that his group never made it far because they got separated from the main detachment as a horde of half-dead people rushed them. Dima never saw the rest of the detachment after that, and most of the soldiers separated with him didn't last very long afterwards either. Dima's only company on the island, aside from the noises all the creatures made, was one remaining soldier named Kreshev. Not wanting to talk about him much more, Dima changed the subject after telling Alexei that Kreshev was now dead too. Not wanting to pry into the loss of a comrade, Alexei let his curiosity rest briefly as the two began to move out. Dima told Alexei he would take him to a more safe location he had found during his months surviving on the island. Dima led them to an underground bunker-like facility on a hillside that was on the opposite side of the anomalous woods. The building was very old and the doors had rusted open. They were marked with the words Orion. Dima definitely knew his way around much better than Alexei could ever hope to, and it didn't hurt that Dima was a trained soldier with a working firearm. The two gathered what resources they managed to find in the small village and started a fire in the bunker to keep warm in the freezing temperatures of Eos. With night growing closer, they had plenty of time now for Alexei to let his curiosity take hold once again. He began to ask Dima of anything else he knew. Dima only fueled his excitement, telling him they would learn plenty tomorrow when they made a trek across the island to gather some supplies from an area he had never been to yet. Alexei knew not to push too quickly, so he dropped it. The two began to speak of life back at home, and Dima shared a few war stories from before his mission on the island. Final day, Alexei woke up to Dima cleaning his rifle in the morning while he prepared for their trek. The two fished in a nearby pond for a quick meal. Dima explained to Alexei that fish was the only suitable food source on the island besides what you could scavenge. Again, Alexei's curiosity immediately took hold as he inquired why that was. Dima just gave a blunt answer of, "You will see soon enough." After their meal, the two began their trip, heading north past a large rock formation with some kind of giant dome-shaped structure that Alexei began to ask about, but was quickly interrupted by Dima telling him he did not know. They arrived at an airfield that had clearly not been used in years. Not long after reaching the airfield, a group of 7 or more boars came rushing out of the woods, charging Alexei and Dima. Dima jumped atop a stack of crates, telling Alexei to do the same, as these were no ordinary boars. Dima unloaded multiple magazines of ammunition into these creatures. They took more ammo than elephant would. Alexei, baffled by this and even more worried about his chances of surviving, kept relatively quiet. It wasn't before long that Alexei's eyes became curious again. Seeing there were very useful farming tools and resources, he took note of her later, telling Dima they could grow some crops if all they had was fish here, while chuckling. The two moved further north, where they passed through a small encampment and a mine of some sort, until they reached some kind of office-type building tucked in between two mountains. As they moved closer to the building complex, Alexei notices a bear up in the mountains and warns Dima, to which he replies, "That's no bear, but do not worry, they have very bad eyes. We won't be learning about that one today, my friend." They enter the compound and make way for the main building's doors as a blizzard starts to stir up. Dima begins to explain that blizzards are very common on the island, but is interrupted by a loud siren coming from every speaker in the complex. Before either can make a move from both entrances of the building, soldiers in full tactical hazmat suits burst through the doors, screaming at the two, "Raise your hands." They both cooperated, but before Alexei could even question anything, Dima spoke up, telling the soldiers in black that he had brought Alexei to them and watched over Sadur, to just let Khrushchev go now because he had done what they asked. The only response was a brief muffled hum, followed by the continuous breathing through their gas masks. Then another one of these soldiers walked in, speaking directly to Dima, telling him that he was to contact him via PDA if he found anyone else living on the island not to come back to this facility. Dima replied, telling the soldier that he had broken his PDA in the search for survivors, to which the soldier, seeming not to care, walked back out of the room. Alexei, baffled at the turn of events, for once kept his mouth shut, as the soldier walked back in with another soldier who was tied up. However, this soldier was in the same camouflage as Dima. Dima burst out yelling, "Khrushchev, I told you I would get you out of this, I told you." The soldier in black interrupted, telling Dima no one was out of anything yet, that their orders had not been followed, and examples must be made. As soon as he finished his words, a gunshot went off, dropping Khrushchev to the floor instantly. Dima collapsed to the floor as well, continuously saying, "I did what you asked." The soldier replied, stating that he did not follow instructions and was told to never return to any of the Eos facilities, as well as to inform them of any current or new movements on the island, and to keep an eye on the Sadur unit now inhabiting the island. Then the soldier turned his attention to Alexei directly, telling him these orders extended him as well, and stating that there is nowhere on this island that he can hide from them. The soldier unmasked Alexei and put a camera up to his face, telling him to state his full name. These soldiers seemed slightly interested in his surname. However, he then turned his attention back to Dima, who was still on the floor in anguish, and said, "Do not forget the soldier." The soldiers in black all gathered around Alexei and Dima, using injectors of some kind on the two, which made them instantly faint. The only thing they remembered before the injection was the words, "Curiosity kills." The two woke up back in a building near the old mine. They had passed on their way. Alexei, angered by the betrayal, scowled at Dima. Dima, still distraught from the loss of his comrade, apologized to Alexei with a very defeated voice Alexei hadn't thought he'd hear from such a strong soldier type like Dima. After hearing and seeing how much Khrushchev meant to Dima, Alexei dropped it, understanding that Dima wasn't given much choice. The two took their time gathering themselves and making sure whatever drugs had been used on them were out of their systems before leaving. Alexei realized while going through his bag that there was now a PDA inside it with singular contact on it listed as the librarian. While they waited, the two conversed about the whole situation. Alexei, with his curious nature, asked who those people were, to which Dima replied, "All I know is they're called Final Day and they own this island." Chapter 2. Yuri Slavostov. The Offer. Yuri grew up in the bustling city of Moscow, always seeking adventure whenever possible. He was known to be quite a madman. Yuri would commonly take long trips into the wilderness to test his own survival skills. He made many like-minded friends during his travels all over Russia and abroad. He would even find a woman named Natasha, who seemed to mirror him and all his interests. The two went on many trips together into the wilderness for years before Natasha eventually decided to leave Yuri. Yuri never truly understood why Natasha left him, but it would lead him to his greatest adventure yet. It would begin in a common bar in the city of Moscow, where Yuri would often spend his free time when not traveling after breakup. During the month of March, Yuri noticed a man at this bar who went by the alias of Osprey. He was one of those private military types. Yuri had seen his kind around the bar before, and was always curious what adventure the man of his field might find. After seeing the same man at the bar a couple times that month, Yuri could not contain his curiosity anymore and approached the man. The approach from Yuri's point of view was in itself an adventure, as this man radiated murderous intent. Before Yuri even uttered a word, the man spoke clearly but quietly, asking Yuri, "You looking for adventure or riches?" The man spoke with an American accent which took Yuri by surprise, as there weren't many English-speaking soldier types in Moscow, but he brushed it off and began to answer. Yuri told the man that he wished for adventure greater than any. In fact, he ached for something more than what the world has offered thus far. Osprey chuckled for a minute before telling Yuri, "That was supposed to be my line. But I guess you've come to the right man. However, you will have to be patient a little longer, as this offer isn't available just yet." Yuri immediately replied, asking what offer he spoke of, while a bit visually annoyed, Osprey began speaking again. Osprey explained that in 2 months' time, on the 20th of May, a group of chosen individuals will be transported somewhere where every breath taken will be filled with adventure. Yuri, of course, was ecstatic at this offer, but knowing that a sense of adventure was no secret in the area, and was a bit skeptical. Yuri questioned the man, but every question was met with the same answer. "I cannot reveal another detail until the time comes," Osprey stated sternly. Eventually getting annoyed with all of Yuri's questions, Osprey got up from his seat and began to walk out of the bar. The only words said were, "See you here on the 20th. For the next 2 months, Yuri tried to contain himself. For the first week he was skeptical, but not after long his mind began to wander. He thought what kind of new adventure could await him. Nothing could be harder than his trek through the Amazon a few years prior. Eventually, Yuri became completely consumed by this idea of some grand adventure. Perhaps it was the allure of not knowing the details, or maybe something altogether different, but Yuri knew one thing. He would show up and meet Osprey on that date. Payment in full. Yuri showed up to the Copper Wolf bar he had met Osprey in months ago. Expecting to see the man awaiting him, Yuri was surprised to see the bar, for the most part, empty. Yuri waited around that bar for the entire day, drinking away his anticipation. Eventually he realized he may have been played for a fool, and that Osprey would never show up again. This made Yuri increasingly angered, drinking more and more until the rest of the night became a blur. The last memory Yuri had of that night was seeing 2 others pass down the bar as everything went black. As Yuri awoke, he realized quickly he wasn't alone. There were over 100 men and women all tied up and slowly awakening, just as Yuri was. Yuri noticed among the several armed men surrounding the detained individuals, one wearing the same gear and mask as Osprey when they had met. He, along with many others, began to question, "What the fuck is this?" To which one of the armed men replied sternly, "You all want adventure or riches soon. Details will be revealed, now quiet." After the rest of the detained individuals awoke, a man in the same gear as all the other soldiers, but with mechanical supports for both arms and legs, walked into the room. And in that moment all was quiet, all was still, and everyone locked their eyes on this man as they waited for an explanation. The man introduced himself only as Loki. He spoke with a European accent Yuri couldn't place. Everyone sat quietly listening as this man explained that they all wished for a chance at a grand adventure, and that they would all have what they wanted, but at a steep cost. He explained that at this point anyone wishing to abandon their chance at adventure and riches to line up next to one of the other soldiers standing near a large metal door. To Yuri's surprise, only 3 of the nearly 100 or so people lined up. They were escorted outside the metal door. As Loki began to speak again, Loki stated that there would be no turning back from here on, and explained that everyone there would be giving up their lives for this opportunity. Everyone started to panic almost immediately, but were told to be silent by one of the other soldiers, as Loki continued to tell them the place they would be going would be a place it is unlikely they would ever return from. Some snickering began from within the crowd, thinking Loki was only trying to hype up the experience to make more money off of them. Loki went on telling everyone about long-lost technology and riches they could potentially find that could change their lives forever. He explained that the harsh cold would be the least of their worries once they see the creatures around the island. Most became skeptical, but continued to listen as Loki explained they would all be armed with weapons and some minor survival needs, but they would have to use what money they had currently to purchase these items. As Loki paused seemingly at the perfect time, 3 shots echoed to the metal building coming from outside. He then continued, as if nothing had happened, telling the group to line up at the door opposite of where the others had lined up at. Condor Securities. Yuri and the group were led out to a building near a giant pier, where there was what appeared to be an armory. One of the group asked what kind of soldiers were these men, to which Loki replied, "We're no soldiers, we are condors." Then Loki directed one of his men to start getting the group geared up and ready while he prepared the ship. Loki disappeared onto the enormous vessel docked at the far end of the pier, carrying a very fancy-looking M4 rifle wearing the same dark blue tactical gear all his men wore. Yuri, who had quite the sum of money on him, gathered with the others near the armory to get what he could for his adventure. All of the gear appeared to be Russian military gear aside from a few other survival items, which took Yuri by surprise. When it came to be Yuri's turn in line, he requested a whole slew of gear, but as the Condor requested his payment, Yuri was shocked to find his money was no longer there. Yuri checked every pocket. He swore he had just counted it. However, the Condor did not care and told him to move on until it was found. Yuri angrily moved out of the line and continued to search for his missing cash, while noticing one of the others in line snickering under his breath. Yuri never found his cash, and as such was given the bare minimum supply to everyone. The group gathered along with the Condors and boarded the ship, awaiting their grand adventure. Yuri, still fuming about his missing money, went to question the man who he had heard snickering earlier. The man had bought quite a large amount of gear and weaponry for this trip, compared to everyone else. He was by far the most equipped next to the Condors themselves. Yuri, growing more frustrated by the minute, decided to call this man out for taking his money, as it was the only possible assumption Yuri could make. The man stood up from the makeshift bar on the ship and approached Yuri, still snickering, as Loki walked into the room. Loki stopped the two, stating that they should make some entertainment out of the whole situation. Loki told the two that they would fight using only the knives provided to them for the gear. Yuri, now beyond rational thought, agreed to this challenge. After all, this is part of the adventure he was seeking. The entire room cleared its center for fight. As the two reached its center, Loki stood between them as a referee and started the fight. Welcome to Eos. When the fight began, Yuri was almost certain he would have the upper hand, as he was much smaller and quicker than this ogre of a man. Yuri was taken by surprise when the man moved incredibly quickly for his size. Slicing at Yuri's face, not wasting a moment to show his surprise, Yuri dodged a strike and countered by punching the man in the ribs. The man stumbled back as Yuri leapt at him with his blade aimed right for the man's neck. The man managed to block Yuri, throwing him off. He may have protected his neck, but the man took a deep slash to his upper arm. The man then reached into his holster, grabbing a firearm as Yuri was getting up. Loki, without a moment of hesitation, blew the man's brains out in front of everyone. Everyone, including Yuri, remained perfectly still and silent, as Loki said, "When you don't play by the rules, you die. Enjoy the ride, everyone." Just as soon as he finished speaking, Loki left the main bar area, disappearing to an upper deck, while Yuri hesitantly gathered the gear off the corpse, realizing how serious the situation might be. The rest of the boat ride was mostly uneventful, but Yuri took the opportunity to get to know some of the other passengers he would be venturing to this place with. As Yuri sat at the bar drinking his anticipation away, he felt an incredible sense of calm come over him as a woman rested her hand on his back as if to call for his attention. The woman standing before him was Natasha, his mouth gaping in surprise. However, he quickly regained his composure, asking what she was doing here. She told him with a bright smile he had come to love so dearly. "I'm here for an adventure just like you." Yuri did not understand where he stood with Natasha anymore, but before he could ask, another man joined in their conversations named Damir, a man who had come from a very low-income area of Russia and wished to have a chance to make it out of his current life situations. The three of them became quite close over their long voyage, drinking and learning what they could about each other, until they were approached by another man named Misha, who wished to join them in their chats. Misha explained that he overheard some of the other Condors talking in one of the upper rooms, saying they didn't think any of the passengers would survive long. Yuri became even more excited than he already had been, and stated he would like to place a bet on their survival. A Condor overheard the statement and began to laugh uncontrollably, and between the laughter yelling, "You won't be able to pay up if you're dead." Finally, the long ship ride came to an end. Land was in sight, and Yuri and his group's blood began to boil with excitement as they awaited the beginning of their ultimate adventure. The ship pulled into a smaller size port than the one they left. However, this port had a lot of fortifications. In fact, it looked more like they were docking in a war zone. Sandbag fortifications littered the roads and roofs, as well as concrete machine gun nests. It was in those moments the passengers began to realize the whole thing might not just be a business pitch. Everyone exited the ship as Loki handed the passengers off to another Condor member, who seemed to be occupying the port prior to their arrival. Without a single word, Loki and his condors returned to the ship and the open sea. The condor who the passengers were left with introduced himself as Zeus and told all the passengers that they would not be allowed back at the port without contacting them prior, using the PDA communications devices they were all supplied with. Zeus explained that there was currently only one contact in the PDAs, and that they were the port's main command terminal. However, they could add as many more contacts from the same devices as they wished. He explained that the PDAs would never work like a regular phone, as they were built to only connect to each other and special-made reception terminals. Zeus then, without more than a word, directed everyone to go make a home for themselves on the island. His final words, before walking back into the main building he had come from, were, "Welcome to Eos, terrors in the night." Yuri and his group, along with many others, stuck together exploring nearby clusters of buildings, searching for suitable long-term shelter. After only 10 short minutes, the group ran into what at first appeared to be a pack of wild boars. However, these creatures charged the group immediately and were not subdued easily. The entire group opened fire on the boars, and many of the group used an entire magazine before finally taking down these abominations. Eventually, after a few more encounters with some boars, they made their way to a big city, where they decided to establish a shelter of sorts. While the adventurous went out and explored, the others would stay back and make sure there was a shelter to come back to. They secured all doors and windows in the tall apartment building and made their base on the top floors, thinking this would keep the mutated animals away. The first night, Yuri and his group stayed awake late, watching their new home from atop the roof. The fire crackled as Yuri stared off into the distant darkness, wondering what could be out there, which direction he should explore first. Before Yuri's mind would wander too far, a woman's loud scream was heard from far off on the outskirts of the city. Shaken, Yuri and the rest of the group tried to see if they could locate where the scream had come from, but with no luck, they quickly made their way to the bottom floor. Yuri instructed Natasha to stay back and barricade the doors behind them, to which she annoyingly agreed as Yuri, Misha, and Demir disappeared into the darkness. As the group made their way through the long abandoned streets of this unknown city towards the direction of the screams, they heard another set of screams. While still female, they seemed to be from a different source entirely. Just as this thought crossed their minds, the original scream returned, but from no more than 30 meters up the road from the group. Yuri, now petrified and confused, directed the group to retreat to a close-by building. The group made it inside a school building, but as they fled towards its screams from many different origins rang through the halls like the bells of the school must have long ago. The group, now unsure what they had gotten themselves into or what was moving towards them in this freezing darkness, started to barricade themselves inside a room on the upper floor. There were no windows in the room they chose. All they could do was wait and listen to now ear-piercing screams repeating from every direction. After about an hour of constant screaming, Demir became more anxious and reached for his sidearm, claiming he couldn't take it any longer. With bloody ears, Demir shoved the barrel of his sidearm into his mouth and pulled the trigger before Yuri or Misha could even react. The two now not only slowly losing their minds because of consistent screaming, but also have just lost one of the few friends they had on the island. With no choice, the two unloaded their weapons and endured the screams throughout the night, praying they would survive whatever was waiting outside. All Yuri could do was lay silently staring into Demir's lifeless eyes, trying to bear the pain of the screams, wondering if this adventure was worth it. The morning after, Yuri and Misha woke the next morning after passing out from the consistent, unbearable pain. Their ears now covered in dried blood. They both expressed their gratitude for having survived the night. The two carefully and quietly removed the barricades from the doors and made their way to the lower floor of the school. There was nothing living in sight, so the two made their way back to the apartment building, taking care to be extra stealthy in case anything was still lurking around. As Yuri and Misha approached the apartment building, Natasha was already removing the barricade from the front door to go searching for them. Relieved, she ran up to the two to greet them, but noticed that Demir was missing from the group. Yuri and Misha could only bow their heads in sadness, which told Natasha all she needed to know. Natasha asked the two what had happened, and explained after they left she never heard a single noise aside from a single gunshot a few hours later. The two, very confused, asked Natasha about all the screaming, and questioned how she could have not heard it as they showed her their bloody ears. They were not able to come to a reasonable conclusion as to what had happened because even after speaking with other inhabitants of the apartments, no one had heard the screams. Only a single gunshot. In fact, no one even heard the first scream aside from Yuri's group. Chapter 3. Jonathan Sparov, Stockholm. Orders. John was raised in a military family in the state of Georgia. He was raised from an early age to become a soldier like his father before him. John joined the U.S. Marine Corps at the age of 18, doing multiple tours in Iraq. After many years in service, John became the scapegoat for a mistake made by one of his commanders. John got dishonorably discharged from service, bringing shame to his proud family of soldiers. Torn apart by shame, John couldn't understand why he was to blame, as he had only done what was ordered of him as he was trained. John grew cold and quite fond of his whiskey over the next couple years, leading up to a very fateful day for the still young John. On March 5th, 2022, John noticed a man at the bar wearing all blue tactical clothing, an unusual sight for a bar in Georgia, but John had nothing to lose anymore, so he struck up a conversation with the man. The man, who gave John the name of Jazz, while intimidating, was quite friendly. The more he drank, the more talkative he became. The two chatted long into the night about their past war experiences and what brought them to the point in life they were at. John, curious of Jazz's lifestyle, began to question him more and more until a deal was struck between the two. Jazz promised if John could beat him at a game of pool, he would vouch for him and get him a job with the Condor Security Company. But if John should lose, he would have to give Jazz his trigger finger. Believing this to be a joke, John thought what could it hurt. The two played, and as John suspected from the amount Jazz had been drinking, John won the game of pool, gaining himself a brand new job with a fancy private security company. Jazz kept his word to John, and as he gathered his belongings and packed them into Jazz's truck, John noticed a jar that seemed to be filled with severed fingers while packing, but John shrugged it off as he had drunk quite a lot himself, and the two left heading for Condor Security's port in Georgia. Jazz arrived with John at the port with many similar-looking soldiers, all intimidating in their own rights, all staring daggers at John. Jazz explained, "Don't worry, we just don't get many civilians around here, especially not with me." The two walked past the guards and into a large metal building, where Jazz was greeted by a man in what can only be explained as a robotic suit of armor. This man says to Jazz, "You really brought one back with you. I've never seen you lose a finger." John's face dropped as the man began chuckling and saying, "What you didn't know, Jazz here is our finest interrogator and a damn good pool player. It seems you've earned your chance." John, now more sober and realizing what had actually been on the line, wondered why it seemed Jazz wasn't playing very well. The man in a robotic suit told John his spot had not been earned yet, and that he would have to complete a complex series of tasks in order to fully benefit from the Condor Security way of life. John was then given a rundown on everything he would need to know to complete his mission as a Condor. His mission was to infiltrate the local populace that would be introduced into the Eos exclusion zone located in northern Russia on the 21st of May. Day of deployment. John trained hard for the next 2 months, regaining any skills or muscle he had lost in his years of civilian life, as well as extensive language training. The way of life for a Condor was not one of luxury, not until you made a name for yourself at least. Many of the lower-ranked members are viewed as prospects essentially until they have completed their first major task, bringing the Condor Security Company a significant sum of money. Once they had become a full-fledged member, however, the rewards were endless. Higher-ranked Condors seemed to live a life of luxury, but it was explained to John that this is only because they have learned to not let their luxury make them weak. The day had finally arrived, May 20th, 2022, and John was ready for his mission. He took an early flight across the world to the Russian Condor port, where his deployment would begin. John arrived to meet a Condor named Loki. He explained to John that soon a large group of individuals would be coming to the port and transported to the island of Eos. John was instructed to join the group of civilians while they were still unconscious and to assume the role of an average civilian seeking riches. John agreed and was handed a small PDA device by Loki to contact him with updates on the civilians. His mission began as the truckloads of civilians came in and were unloaded. John slipped into the group pretending to be unconscious until the first person awoke. There wasn't much happening for the first half of the trip until one of the passengers started a fight with one of the more geared passengers. John thought, finally some entertainment on this long boat ride. Loki, however, interrupted the fight to make it a more fair ordeal, stating it would be a fight with blades. John was excited to see some action. However, the excitement was short-lived as the more geared passenger pulled a gun and was swiftly executed by Loki. The winner of the fight had been drinking and getting to know some of the other passengers after the fight. John thought this was as good an opportunity as any to spark up conversation with a man, introducing himself with a broken Russian accent as Misha, just another passenger on this voyage to Eos. Chapter 4. Colton Stockholm. Introduction to radiation. Colton was an American-born man who at the early age of 25 joined the UN Peacekeepers. He became part of a special branch being founded called the Scientific Ecological Disaster Investigation and Recovery Unit, a paramilitary research organization made up of a subset of NATO countries. Its mandate is to investigate ecological dangers in regions that are typically war-torn or suffering from dramatic civil unrest. Their first major assignment would be investigating the incident at the Eos exclusion zone, located in the far reaches of northeastern Russia. A smaller portion of the island was owned by the U.S., which forced the Russian government to cooperate. The entire island was split by the international date line. Because of this, it was once known as Tomorrow Island. From what is known, Eos was once a prosperous island with many small villages and even a mid-sized city. Most of its citizens were miners or factory workers. Sometime during the month of November 2000, all contact was lost with the island, and it was declared an exclusion zone by the Russian Federation. Nothing more is known aside from on that day the island froze over. No contact was ever made. The Federation has cooperated with the UN to allow them to investigate the cause of this incident, claiming that even the Federation has not been successful in infiltrating the dangers of Eos. Being part of the special group, Colton underwent years of training in dealing with chemical and biological disasters. The training wasn't easy, but their first mission would be even more complicated. The radiation training alone seemed to take months on end. Colton, being more of a soldier than scientist, he wasn't very fond of essentially going back to school. The radiation training was the worst for Colton. He would be forced to not only learn everything known about radiation, but also wear a lot of gear to counteract it. The island of Eos currently had never been infiltrated, and all squadrons had gone dark, so what chemical or biological threats lingered was unknown. At first, Colton was tired of the constant lessons, but eventually he grew very curious about the island and what they might find there. His curiosity started after the Federation had finally gotten onto the island, which brought back reports of boars with hide, like steel, but not much else, as like the rest they went radio silent. His curiosity fueled his inspiration to learn more. Colton began to excel in working with technological devices. The day was soon approaching for Colton and the newly founded Sadur unit to take to the seas and establish themselves in this unknown hellscape. All their training would be put to use finally. Day of the Dead. Early in the morning as day broke on April 1st, 2021 Colton and 24 other highly trained Sadur members gathered alongside hundreds of Russian Federation soldiers at port in northern Russia. Their mission was clear. Sadur would hold the back of the formation and let the soldiers clear a path for them. Their objective was a small military compound that should possess the means to create a mobile lab and base to the direct south of the port they would arrive at. For some unknown reason, outside radio signals were blocked on the island, and communications would have to be established as well. The ride across the sea didn't seem long with everyone's anticipation, but as they drew closer to the island, there was a loud crash as the entire ship shook. The vessel had hit a rather large chunk of ice that now surrounded the island. However, the soldiers in Colton's group made it to the lifeboats and paddled ashore. Once they all arrived, they were greeted by a group of privately contracted mercenaries called the Condor Security Company, who the Federation hired to secure the port for this mission, and as retreat should it go awry. Colton and his group moved at the rear of the formation, but not far enough back that they couldn't see what happened in the front. That day, no one was prepared enough for what they would find on that hellscape of an island. As the formation moved south towards their objective, the cold was so harsh even the Federation were visibly affected. But it wasn't long before the group ran into what looked like a civilian. The Condor securities had warned them about seemingly human creatures attacking the port, so they moved with caution. The majority of the group held back, while a small group broke off to dispatch or detain the human-like creature that stood not 100 yards in front of them. As the group moved closer to the creature, they surrounded it from behind a few abandoned houses it stood near and requested surrender. The creature, clearly not a stable mind, was dressed as a government scientist, similar to how Colton's group was geared. It immediately charged a man who called out to it, and began ripping into pieces with its bare hands as the other soldiers fired upon it. The creature didn't take long to kill, but it lived long enough to severely maim the soldier. He didn't live more than a minute after the creature was subdued. As the soldiers dispatched the creature, however, something the entire formation had never expected happened. As it appeared from thin air, hundreds upon hundreds of humanoid creatures, just like the original one seen, came from every corner behind every house and every tree. The creatures were dressed as scientists, military, and even normal civilians. Some more mutated than others, but all suffered severe deformities. The group of Federation soldiers at the front who had separated from the main detachment were overwhelmed instantly. Colton and his men were still far from the actual battle. All they could do was watch in confusion and fear as the Federation soldiers began making firing line after firing line, eventually dispatching all the creatures. They suffered incredible losses, however. The battlefield littered with bodies, as if a war had taken place. Even Colton, who had been to many war-torn countries, had not seen anything like this. The formation, now less than 100 men, including Colton and the other 24 Sadur, continued south towards their objective, which wasn't far at this point. Walking through the graveyard of bodies, Colton thought back to a story his father had once told him of his time in Vietnam at the Battle of Hue. Colton thought that this must be what it looked like there. As the formation reached the wood line ahead from the battlefield, Colton and his group got a very good look at these creatures. They appeared to be human at one point or another, but were severely mutated, most likely from prolonged exposure to radiation. As one of Colton's allies was getting a closer look at one of the creatures, suddenly the creature, returning from the dead, grabbed the man, biting at his neck, while the rest of the Sadur unloaded on the creature. Most of the group, not realizing that behind them the rest of the battlefield returned to life. Colton had never seen such a horrible sight before, even with all his experiences with death. Men were torn to pieces in front of him. One of his closest friends, named Alan, had his eyeballs ripped from the sockets as one of the creatures grabbed at him. By the time the Federation returned to assist, most of Colton's group were beyond rescue. The Federation soldiers secured a retreat for what remained of Colton's group and suffered a few more casualties of their own. However, the Federation began to learn these creatures must be shot in the head in order to keep them down, at least for a significant amount of time anyway. The formation of men, now less than 40 men, moved up the hills into the woods before the creatures would awaken again. Finally, with their destination in sight, they rejoiced at the thought of being able to get out of the blistering cold. Colton and his group waited on the hillside, where they were able to see back to the horde of corpses walking in the opposite direction, while the Federation continued down the hill towards the compound. As the Federation entered the compound, immediately half of them collapsed to their knees in pain while firing their weapons blindly through the air, some even hitting their comrades. The soldiers not affected took cover and fired into the compound until their magazines were empty. Colton and his group again were forced to watch from the hillside as half of the remaining soldiers perished, without even being able to see what was causing this inside the compound. Eventually, after a lot of gunfire, the remaining Federation gave Colton's group the clear to move towards the base while they recovered at the gates. Colton observed that the horde of dead men, as they began to call them, were far enough away to not be disturbed by all the shots. The creature that was inside the base looked very similar to the deformed humans they began calling dead men, except it clearly had some type of psychic abilities, as it affected the soldiers instantly without touching them. The quiet before the storm. Everyone began to settle around a fire inside the compound after setting up a makeshift barricade with guards at the front gate. After warming up, Colton and his unit began to set up a makeshift laboratory to examine the creature, while the soldiers began to set up bunks for the night. The night was relatively quiet aside from a few distant shots, which the Federation wrote off as the Condors. The following morning, as the Federation soldiers gathered at the gates, Colton stopped their commander. Colton had observed a small military base and shipwreck off to the west of the small village they had battled with the dead in. Realizing this location could hold valuable resources and information, Colton urged Federation Command to help investigate and clear the location. Having lost the majority of his men, Colton didn't have much choice in the matter. They needed help. There were about 10 total Sadur soldiers left at this point, and their mission began to look more grim by the moment, seeing that the Federation command was hesitant to assist and risk losing more of its soldiers. Colton stepped up during this discussion, speaking for Sadur as a whole, telling the commander without more supplies their mission would not be possible. Colton urged the commander to assist with this last mission, for if not, it would mean Sadur would also have to retreat from their mission back to mainland, meaning all the lives lost were for nothing and the mission failed. Having not a single failed mission on record, the commander took this more seriously than most. Knowing this was why he had been chosen for this impossible mission in the first place, he hesitantly agreed. Scientific marvel. The Federation rallied up and moved out again with Colton and his men following, but this time alongside the Federation. Sadur's original leader had fallen the day prior, and no higher ranks were left. Because of this, Colton now led the remaining Sadur members after stepping up during the discussion that morning with the Federation. The troops made their way through the frosty hills back down to the village they'd passed the previous day, taking care to be extra observant and quiet in case of more dead men in the area. They made it past the village to a little dilapidated dock, heading out to the small isle where the military base and shipwreck were located. As they neared the end of the rickety old dock, the final stretch of it collapsed, throwing several of the troops in the freezing cold waters. They quickly swam to shore and gathered around a fire made by Colton and his men. Hypothermia would be quick to set in if they did not regulate their temperatures quickly. A detachment moved ahead to secure one of the barracks buildings for the rest to warm up in. The base had seemed to be abandoned, and most of the barracks even had supplies still in them. Colton knew he did well in choosing this location and felt accomplished with his first orders as the new Sadur leader. This sense of accomplishment was short-lived as the group heard howling from outside the barracks like nothing anyone had ever heard before. Most of the Federation soldiers went out to clear the compound and search for whatever made the soul-shaking howls, while Colton and his men tended to the soldiers who fell into the water. The Federation dispatched the creatures easy enough, and these ones did not return for the dead. However, they were clearly of a mutated nature. They appear to be large rat-like creatures the size of the average dog, with fangs the size of the average human arm. After gathering what supplies they could, the troops moved towards a wrecked ship. As they entered the ship, a loud growling was heard echoing through the rusty hull, alongside the constant creaking of the tide washing against the wreck. The troops approached with extreme caution, eventually finding a cave-like rock formation the ship had crashed into, filled with bones of animals and humans. Just as they came across the cave, a creature standing taller than any man with long spine-like appendages sticking out its back, and bulky rock-like skin came darting through the ship towards them. The troops were able to get out of the way as the creature appeared to not be too fast. However, after several magazines worth of ammunition was used, the creature stood seemingly unaffected. Luckily, one of the Federation soldiers had a PKM belt-fed machine gun in the pit of bones. Using this, the soldiers were able to penetrate the creature's thick skin and subdue it. As the final shots rang through the hull of the ship, one of the soldiers was heard yelling from inside the cave. Colton, in command, questioned the soldier, and he explained that one of their men was pulled into the back of the cave where a small swirling illusion of some kind could faintly be seen. The soldier explained that as he got pulled towards this illusion, he disappeared. Colton urged the soldiers to stand back, not knowing what this illusion could be. However, the Federation received radio contact from the soldier, who disappeared claiming he was safe, but inside some dark building. The commander then decided they would push forward against Colton's wishes and enter this portal. Colton understood the risks of something this unknown, but understood the Federation could not leave a mission incomplete with a soldier left behind. Colton and the rest of the Sadur unit never saw a single one of the soldiers ever again after that day. As the last soldier went into the portal, Colton and his troops stood guard awaiting their hopeful return. However, the portal seemed to destabilize, and after making some loud, strange noises, disappeared just like the Federation soldiers did.